Harvard, and then he is now an assistant professor in the Industrial and Systems Engineering Department at NC State University, where he's also a graduate faculty in operations research. His lab is Sustainable and Resilient Systems, and his group looks at the impact of climate change and extreme events on infrastructure and communities. He's also on the board of the International Society for Risk Analysis and the International Symposium on Sustainable Systems and Technology. With that,
well, thanks so much, Rich. Thanks to all of you as well for coming on a Friday afternoon. Having a happy hour afterwards is a really good way. I'm going to report back that this is a good way to bump up symposium attendance. Ours are at 8 o'clock in the morning and slim pickings sometimes. Well, so thanks so much for coming. As Roshi said, our research group is really focused on the impacts of climate change and natural hazards on communities and infrastructure. So I am from North Carolina. I actually took this picture. This is a picture from Wilmington, North Carolina. So this was a place that was impacted by Hurricane Florence in 2018. And the big focus of what we do as a research group is evaluating the risk that communities face as a result of things like hurricanes or major disruptions. And we focus on decision-making that communities or infrastructure systems can make in order to promote their resilience. So when we think about the concept of resilience, I start most of my talks with this figure, and it says coming back better than ever, which is a really nice way to sort of conceptualize this. And we'll talk a little bit about that through the talk today. This is a restaurant that's right on the beach that was really heavily impacted by Hurricane Florence. They had, I think the roof came off and there was a bunch of flooding. So then they put this up. It's a great representation of resilience. It is not an endorsement of the restaurant in any way. It's not particularly good. So don't go there. But their climate policy is really good. So what we're going to talk about today are two different applications of risk, evaluating risk to different types of systems. And we're going to talk about access to essential services as our lens for doing this. So we'll dig into a little bit more about what this means. And we'll talk about one of them in a food access domain and one of them in a water access domain. And in both of these circumstances, the punchline or the sort of takeaway of what we're doing today is that access is a very multidimensional concept. So we'll talk specifically about how some of these dimensions interact with one another, what these dimensions are, what we might be able to do about them. And so we'll kick this off by talking about food access. And so we may have been familiar with the term a food desert. We may have heard that we live in a food desert or that X percentage of Americans live in food deserts. One of the other conclusions that I'll just leave you with as a sort of punchline from the beginning is that we are trying to move away from calling them food deserts because food deserts, it is evocative of a geographic place. And we really imagine that a desert is a place that where when we say food desert, we mean a place with lack of food access. And this is ultimately something that is a lot more than just not being geographically close to something, and we'll really talk about that in depth. So if we're thinking about the sort of problem of food security or food insecurity in America, the USDA is the sort of agency that does a lot of analysis of this, and their current estimate is that about 13 to 14% of US households are food insecure, meaning they do not have reliable access to food or healthy food geographically close by to them. And of course, there is a good idea that having access to food around you impacts your health, but that connection is actually a little bit tenuous depending on how we think about access, and we'll talk about that. And of course, this is something that has strong biases along racial and socioeconomic lines. So this is a map that I pulled from the USDA's food access map this morning. This is Washington, D.C., zoomed in a little bit to try to focus on these areas. And these green blocked out areas are, as the USDA would define it, places that are food deserts. These are places that do not have reasonable geographic access for most of their residents to groceries or food available in their neighborhoods. And so this is something, it's called the USDA Food Atlas. I invite you to go look it up. But when we're thinking about this, this is done geographically. And so this will be our sort of starting point for the day. How these maps work is that they use a bunch of map software and they say, what's close by, right? How many grocery stores do I have that are nearby to me? Let's look at the sort of average distance of people in my community to grocery stores and say if I have good access or if I have bad access. But if we pause for a second and we think about where you might shop for groceries, it's very easy to imagine that distance is one of many factors that we would consider and the things that lead to us having access. We probably all don't shop at our closest grocery store or our closest place that even has food available to us. There might be a little convenience store or a sort of mom and pop store that has something that's right on the corner and maybe they've got candy and they have light beer and they have lottery tickets, but maybe they don't have navel oranges, right? Or something that might be important to you. Maybe there's a Whole Foods around the corner from you, and you're like me and you don't quite have Whole Foods money. And so you go somewhere else to try to shop for groceries that might be affordable. It might be that you have specific dietary restrictions or some reason to want to buy foods that are only at certain places versus another, right? All of these things, we all have a grocery store nearby to us that we like but has bad produce. This is the story of my mom as a kid would come back and she would say, I can't go to this grocery store anymore because we got a bad watermelon, we got a bad banana. She was always worried about the bad produce. So if we can all sort of intuitively attach ourselves to something like this, that maybe we're not shopping at the place that is closest to us, it is easy to imagine that we should be thinking about access to food as something that is more dimensional than just geography. So if I'm thinking about how to improve food access, this starts to lead us towards potentially other ideas besides just putting more grocery stores somewhere or more food access points nearby to us. So this is the sort of takeaway, right? That there are spatial dimensions of food access, things that are geographically determined, and there are aspatial dimensions of food access. And notionally, we all have a good idea of what this might mean, and we're not the first people to think about this, as it might turn out. And so there's a long history of thinking about access through different dimensions. And so this is a paradigm of 5 dimensions of access put forward by 2 folks, Penchansky and Thomas, in the early 1980s. And they set out to do this with respect to healthcare. So these definitions were originally created with respect to healthcare access. And I think maybe their crowning achievement is that they came up with 5 dimensions of access that all start with A's. So we have availability, accessibility, affordability, accommodation, and acceptability. All of these are ways to subdivide the concept of access into smaller, more bite-sized, or more easily approachable things. So the first 3 of these are very intuitive. Availability means that there's a sufficient supply. We've adapted these for grocery stores or sort of food access. There's a sufficient supply of grocery stores in a physical area. The shelves are stocked. They have types of things on the store. If I was imagining that I was someone who was setting out to go measure availability, I might do something like what the USDA did. I might go try to find grocery stores that are nearby to me. There are lots of what are called food surveys, where people go into grocery stores and they do audits of the types of things that are provided. So not only do I see that this is a grocery store, I can see the types of things that are on the shelves, very readily available. The surveys are hard to scale, but it's very easy for me to look geographically in a large extent at where these stores might be. Accessibility has to do with how easy is it for me to get there. Is this something that is easily, not just is it close to me, is it something that I can get to? Does it meet my needs? If it is, I'm someone who takes the bus, is it easy for me to get there on the bus? If I'm someone who uses a wheelchair, is it easy for me to get there via something that allows me to travel on a wheelchair? And affordability is the other sort of easy one to think about. We've all got this concept. It's exactly what it sounds like. Is this place going to meet the relative needs that I have when it comes to things being more or less expensive? So these dimensions of access, relatively straightforward. But then there's 2 others, accommodation and acceptability. Accommodation we think about as how well a grocery store adapts to people's needs. If I would like to buy halal food, does my grocery store have halal food? If I'm looking to buy baby food, does a grocery store have baby food? How well is this meeting the needs that I have? And then finally, we have acceptability. Does this meet my personal standards? Is it nice? Is it a place that I'd like to go? Is it a place that I would like to visit? So these last 2 dimensions, there's a little bit of ways to look at this, but there are not standardized methodologies for evaluating these. And the question we sort of ask is, if I include these in a measure, if I measure them somehow and include them in a measurement of access, what happens? Do these things align with the types of geographic trends that I might see? Is a food desert that includes all of these dimensions the same as a food desert that is just based on distance? This is our question that we set out to answer. And there's lots of work measuring one of them, but here we're trying to measure all of them. And one quick note about that is that there's been a bunch of public health literature that has looked at the relationship between store proximity and health outcomes. And they looked at it they said, we want to make sure that this sort of concept of a food desert actually is doing what we want, and that people who live by to healthy food are actually eating healthy food. And the exact quote is, store distance has remarkably consistently showed no association with diet across a variety of diet outcomes. This was a paper done in 2012 that they then did, and people have looked at this again and again, saying, surely these CASP folks didn't get this right. And this has continually come up that geographic access to something is not actually moving the needle on health outcomes. So again, we're curious, maybe there's other dimensions that might contribute to this as well. So to do this, we want to try to capture what people think about the food access around them. We want to try to evaluate these aspatial dimensions. And so to do this, we found out that Google actually has a product that we would call the Aspatial Food Dimension Access Survey. And it's nationwide, and millions of people participate on this on a day-to-day basis. And it's actually called Google Maps. Google Maps has our accidental food access survey. And so this is just a sort of aside from the presentation, if you are ever down and want to perk yourself up, go to your local grocery store, find one that has a lot of reviews, and just start reading them. They are very entertaining, they are very rich, they are very narrative. This is a very easy way to capture the perceptions of the people in your community. And so here's some examples of different, I don't know if you guys can read them exactly, but I'll read you the highlights. These are some examples of Google reviews from a grocery store nearby to campus at NC State where I work. And so the first one says, lots of empty items, didn't find all that I need. The second one says, this is one of the go-to shopping centers in Avon Ferry. This is a sort of neighborhood nearby to campus. They have all of the things that I might need. There's ample parking, there's ample space. The staff are really helpful. You have Go Raleigh as well as NC State Wolfline bus stops. So these are both of our transportation systems that are named. And then the next one says we've changed the hours to from 6 a.m. to 6:15. People are standing around outside and it's not open. Not very cool, Club Teat. The grocery store is called Harris Teeter, and I guess people call it Club Teat, which is very funny. But this is all of this overpriced. We can imagine that people are almost by name referring to these dimensions of access, right? So it's very easy to try to map these two to each other if we sort of look at these and say, well, this is probably about availability. This is probably about accessibility. But what we want to be able to do is to try to do this in an automated way or to try to do this at scale. We don't want to have to pay a bunch of people to go through here and read all of these and label what we think they match. We did that to make sure that this method works. But to do this, we actually had to do a pretty rigorous natural language processing and data science exercise to be able to do this. So if you are not a person who's interested in hearing a bunch of sort of mathematical vector processing of text, great time to check your emails. We'll come back to it in a second. We'll talk a little bit about the methods. But what we did is develop a big data processing pipeline that takes in all of these reviews, does a series of filtering and topic modeling and processing on them to extract only the bits that are relevant. There are the most common Google review that you would see in the world just says, good. And we realize that that's probably not informative, right? So we have to make sure that we're extracting some substance. And then what we do is we pass all of these things into what is called an embedding model. This is the big column on the left-hand side. And an embedding model in very simple words, and this is oversimplifying a little bit, a vector embedding model takes a series of text, takes a series of words, and it just maps it as a point in a really high dimensional space. So if we're in 3 dimensions, a vector embedding model is going to just start putting words or sentences in different parts of this room, but it does it in such a way, this is a machine learning model, it does it in such a way that words that are similar or words that have similar meanings end up in similar parts of the space. So if I read through a bunch of text and I just doing this in this room, up here might be all the angry stuff, over here might be all the excited stuff, over here might be all the things indicating disgust, right? And so we map these things into this high dimension. This is a technique that was largely developed by big tech companies because this is something that goes into large language models. So the first thing when you type something into ChatGPT, the first thing that happens is it takes your text and it puts it into an embedding model. And it says, let's turn this into a series of ones and zeros that my computer can munch on a little bit more easily. And it moves it up into this high dimensional space. I'm using this example of 3 dimensions because it's kind of easy to imagine a room. In this case, we put it into a 348 dimensional space, something like ChatGPT puts it into millions of dimensional space. But we take these Google reviews and we map them into this really high dimensional space. And then we take definitions of all of these different dimensions of access, and we do the same thing. And so what we can do is we can label that corner of the room the affordability corner, and this corner of the room the accessibility corner, and this corner of the room the accommodation corner. And so then we can look at where the Google reviews are relative to these dimensions, and we can see how close they are. And this starts to give us a sense of being able to score Google review text in one of these dimensions to figure out if we're actually talking about some of these aspatial dimensions of access. So this at a very, very high level is how we do this. This is a process called vector embedding with matched inference, and it's called a zero-shot learning approach because what it means is if I have a new thing, I can just map it and figure out my score. I don't have to develop training data. So lots of time machine learning models, an alternative way of doing this, would be to go through and label and have a bunch of people all get in a room and say, we think this is about affordability. And we would label every one of the Google reviews ourselves, and we would train a model to learn those relationships. Here we don't have to do that, right? And if we just got new data, we can throw it in the space, we can see how it scores, and I don't have to go through this process of labeling. I can do it in 0 shots is the term. So we do this for all of these different reviews, and ultimately we can bring it back to a score. So I can say there are, for each individual store, there are X number of reviews that talk about this dimension of access and X number of reviews that talk about Y dimension of access. And so we have to do one more step, is we have to figure out if they're good or if they're bad. So the last step that we do is take my predicted dimensions, this is at the very top, and we look at the stars that the user gave to it. So when you put something in Google Maps and you give a review, you give a star, 1 to 5, and then you write your text. We take the text and we say the text is maybe about one of these dimensions, and we looked and said, basically, it turns out nobody gives things 2, 3, or 4 stars. Everybody gives stuff a 1 star or a 5 star. And this is certainly a bias that we're going to have to deal with, but it means that people either love what they're seeing or they hate what they're seeing. So we scored our dimensions by, if you have a +1, you get a +1 if you talked about this dimension and you gave it 5 stars. So if you talked about a grocery store, we label it as affordable, and you gave it 5 stars, then that's good. We gave that a +1. And if you talked about a grocery store, we think it's about affordability, and you gave it 1 star, we give that a -1. And we can aggregate this over all of the different grocery stores that we have. And we did this in a case study of the city of Raleigh with a little bit of buffer around it. So this shape is showing the shape of our city. We added a little bit around the edges just to make sure that we weren't sort of artificially cutting things off. We take every grocery store in each one of these dimensions, we score it, we rank it in all of these dimensions, and then we kind of normalize it. So everything we're going to talk about is z-score normalized, so it'll all be in units of standard deviation. So if something scores a +2 in affordability, it is 2 standard deviations above the mean better in affordability. So we zoom all this out so that we can talk about percentages. And I'll note that I did hire a bunch of undergrads to go through and just double check us. And they went through and they manually labeled all of these. And if we looked at the top 2 dimensions that we predicted and the top 2 dimensions that the undergrads predicted, they match 93% of the time. So we feel pretty good that this works reasonably well. And then we'll walk through an example here that we also was a nice one for us to sort of validate this with. So here's our map of affordability in the city of Raleigh. Each circle's size is corresponding with the number of reviews that we saw about affordability. And the color represents how well it's scored. Things that are green are more affordable. Things that are closer to a red or a brown are less affordable. I'm colorblind, so it's a bit of a guess to me that we're talking about a shade of gray to a shade of gray. The green ones are the ones that are more affordable. The reddish, brownish ones are less affordable. And we did this with affordability because we can validate this with other sources, right? So I'm going to highlight these 3 stores. The one in the top right is the the best affordability one we've seen. The one in the middle is a sort of average affordability store, and the one in the bottom left is the lowest affordability score that we've seen. So if we're identifying these 3 grocery stores, when we figured out which ones they were, the one in the top right is an Aldi, the one in the middle is a Wegmans. I'm not sure if you guys do Wegmans in DC. You guys have got a Wegmans. Okay, a sort of neutral affordability grocery store. And then in the bottom left, we have a Whole Foods. The Whole Foods was expensive, the Aldi was cheap, right? Aldi is a grocery store that their stated aim is to be the cheapest grocery store in town. So they will take a loss, right? Their whole business model is that we are going to be the most affordable grocery store. This matches with what we see just from the text of Google reviews. Same thing with Whole Foods, right? Whole Foods kind of exists without an understanding that any of us have budgets, and food can be priced whatever it is. And we see that here as well, that again, just using the text, it shows up as affordable. So we breathed a sigh of relief. We have some good evidence that this might work. Let's dig into this a little bit and sort of see what some of the results are, and thinking about these aspatial dimensions as well as our spatial dimensions of access. So we do this for all of them. This figure is just to make sure you put your contacts in. But if I imagine I live here, so this is an apartment complex that is really close to our office on campus. This figure is showing what we would imagine you would do if you had no preferences. You weren't thinking about these aspatial dimensions at all. You were just trying to go to places that were close by to you. You, in this case, would be 1.33 miles as the crow flies from your nearest grocery store. If you tried to drive, it would be 7 minutes. If you took the bus, it'd be 25. If you walked, it'd be a half an hour. And now what we can do is start ratcheting up these thresholds for these other dimensions of access. So I can say, what if people only wanted to go to grocery stores that were average or above in terms of affordability? So we've normalized all of these things. So I can say, this is, of all of the grocery stores that I have, let's just look at the average affordability and above, and let's see what distance those would be. So if this same person wants to just go to an average or above affordability store, suddenly they're driving closer to 2.25 miles as the crow flies. Their driving distance doesn't increase too much by time. If I also said that I want them to be generally higher in availability, maybe this person had weird hours or they needed to have very specific food types, then all of a sudden they could be traveling closer to 3.5 or 4 miles. So we see that as I start to ratchet up these perceptions or people's preferences for the stores around them, if I start to increase this threshold, our distance increases. This makes a lot of sense. One other thing we can do is we can actually look at individual stores and we can try to figure out what people were talking about that led their scores to be one way or another. So I don't know if Harris Teeter has made its way all the way up here, but we've got Harris Teeter's in North Carolina. It's our sort of default grocery store. So we have 2 Harris Teeters. In this case, they're about a mile from each other, generally speaking, in what we would call the same part of town. Both of these grocery stores have got about 1,300 Google reviews. The average number of stars for each of them is about 4.5. So by all external measures, these things are looking pretty similar. But we can break down the dimensions of how they score in each dimension. And we can actually extract specific information that is consistent in reviews that rank it more positively or rank it more negative. So in this particular difference, if I look in the bottom left, I have both of the bar charts are showing the rankings for each dimension for both stores. And we see that for the most part, they tend to match, except for the accommodation score in the middle, where one scores positive and the other scores negative. So these grocery stores, despite otherwise having all the same measures that we could look at, score very differently in this dimension. And this dimension is accommodation. We can then look at the reviews that are talking about accommodation, and we can see what the main topics or themes are among those. And the main topics or themes that we see are related to operating hours. So we see that in the top, this figure is showing perception of operating hours. In the top right, that's showing the dark gold is how many good ones we have for the store, for one store, and then the second bar chart is showing it for another store. And so we can see that they're ranked rather differently with respect to their operating hours. So we thought that these stores might have wildly different operating hours, and they don't. These stores have got the exact same operating hours. So our hypothesis for this is that this is an indication that our food environment and the things that are nearby to me are not just what is available, but it is whether or not what is available is matching the needs of the people who are trying to access it. We haven't found more data to be able to support this, but our hypothesis is that for one of these stores, the population needs the store to be open later, right? There is something about the population of people in that area that mean that stores open later or stores open earlier is a bigger factor for them. It is the product of what you need and what the neighborhood around you can provide. So this is really cool, right? We can dig into this at a really high level. We see one more sort of takeaway with this, and this in the bottom left is a Food Lion, and I don't think Food Lion as a store has made it all the way up here. Food Lion is what we would call a value-oriented grocery store, right? Their whole goal is to have things be very cheap. And we see this Food Lion has a pretty poor affordability score. And if we were to overlay this with average household incomes, we see this is a relatively low-income part of town. Lots of college students in this area. Generally speaking, the higher proportion of people who are renting. And so again, our hypothesis here is that this is because the people that are in the neighborhood around this are not matching the needs of the store, or the store is not matching the needs of the people who live around. So our takeaways from this at a very high level, our aspatial access can be assessed, and we've done a little bit of validation of this by using text and values from Google review text. And then if we just start to compare this against a more traditional access-based measure, these are looking a little bit different from one another. So there's still a lot more to do. Some of our recent work in this area, which I didn't get a chance to add the figures for, has looked at the types of community or demographic characteristics that are corresponding with different dimensions of access. And what we see is that standard dimensions, if I'm just looking at geographic distance, there's a lot of literature, and we did an analysis, and it backs up in Raleigh as well, that standard dimensions of access, so people living closer to grocery stores, is usually associated with higher income areas and census block groups that have a higher proportion of white residents. We see that as a very common trend across the literature. We see that also in Raleigh, and we also did the same analysis for all of the dimensions individually, and we saw that all of them followed that trend except for affordability. So affordability was lower in places with higher income, and affordability was higher in places with lower income, and affordability was lower in places that were predominantly white, and affordability was higher in places that were predominantly Black. So we're still working on hypotheses for this, but it is leading us to a larger sort of other set of things that we're thinking about including, which is that grocery stores make decisions about where to go. So we don't exactly know how to accommodate for this, but it's another sort of latent factor in this, is that grocery stores are not, natural scientific phenomenon that emerge out of nowhere. There's a series of decisions that are being made by grocery stores to move into neighborhoods, and that's also something that is sort of playing under this. So more work to come, but it's a nice way to try to compare a couple of these different dimensions and how they might change as a result of geographic dimensions. And I didn't have a good transition, so we used an emoji and an arrow and another emoji. Another system that we have studied, again, through this lens of different dimensions of access is water systems, and specifically household water systems. This means like the municipal entity that brings water to you. I got a chance a couple months ago to go to the DC water headquarters, which I think is in the Navy Yard by like the baseball park. And it's this beautiful building, right? They have all kinds of high security gates. It's very fancy. It's a very high-tech water facility. And this is very common in big cities, but also we have to sort of imagine that there's a perspective, right, from DC water down to small municipal water utilities that serve maybe 300 or 400 people in like a rural part of Georgia, a rural part of Tennessee. So we're looking at the sort of range between these two of them. And our question is, how do people access water that is provided to them through these services? So this study specifically focuses on California, where recent analyses have come up with the idea that there is over 1 million people who lack access to clean, safe, affordable drinking water. So in California, there's about 55 million people. 1 million of those people, either their water is unaffordable, it is unreliable, or it is unclean. One of those three things is violated. There's actually on the books in California a human right to water. So people have the right to safe, clean, affordable drinking water. This is not something that's legally enforceable. You can't sue someone for violating your human right to water, but it is enshrined in law as a right. And there are obviously racial and economic barriers. There are racial economic divides where historically disadvantaged communities experience more human right to water issues. And so if we look specifically at water affordability, recent studies have found that water prices, so the bill that you pay for water at the end of the month, that bill is rising 2 or 3 times faster than inflation, and this is nationwide. This is for most people in the country. Water bills are going up. Water bills, however, are not usually a primary source of expense for most households. The quote, for most people, water is not unaffordable, but this is a problem for people of low income, right? Water affordability is a significant challenge for people with lower income. And our hypothesis was that this might be exacerbated by drought stress. So if there's a drought, our thought is this might impact water affordability. And our sort of hypothesis for why this would be the case is that ultimately water affordability is evaluated. I take my monthly water bill and I divide it by my monthly household income. This is how I think about water affordability. So I might say if my water bill constitutes more than 3% of my monthly household expenses or my monthly household income, then my water is unaffordable. And there's different ways you can change the numerator. There's different ways you can change the denominator. Maybe this is my water bill and my sewage treatment. Maybe this is all of my municipal utilities. Maybe I'm dividing this by my post-rent income, or I'm a post-housing income, or a post-tax income. So I can change the numerator or I can change the denominator. But ultimately, I'm going to take my rough cost for water divided by my rough ability to pay for it, and I'm going to compare that to some kind of a percentage. If I think about this, then the only thing that's driving my water affordability is either my income or my bill, right? These are the only things that are going to change my affordability. And so my water bill is the thing that we were interested in looking at. And my water bill is really just a function of how much water I use and how much I pay for water, right? My tariff structure associated with my water bill. So a lot of times, if you've never actually opened your water bill and you just set it to auto pay a long time ago and it pays, water bills typically have this interesting sort of volumetric piecewise structure to them. So most of the time you pay a fixed charge. So in my example, it's $10.25. You pay $10.25 no matter what. If you use no water, you pay $10 per month to the water utility. And then you pay $5 for every sort of increment of water that you use. The standard for this is to measure water in CCF, centum cubic feet, which is a bizarre unit. It is 100 cubic feet of water, which roughs out to about 700 gallons. So here you're going to pay $5 for every 700 gallons of water that you use. Sometimes water utilities will add multiple tiers. So maybe I pay $3 for the first 5 CCF. So I pay $3 for the first 3,500 gallon, $5 per CCF for the first 3 CCFs. And then I pay $6 a gallon for the rest of them. So you can operate this as a progressive tax, right? That increases the more water that you use. And the idea behind this is I'm trying to incentivize people to use less water. I'm going to keep the essential water that you need for daily function relatively cheap. As your costs start to go up, right? As you start to use water for what we might deem superfluous needs, then I'm going to charge you a little bit more for that. But this is the rough structure of most water bills most of the time. And so what we have to think about here, because we're curious about what happens to water affordability, so this is access to water during a drought, is what happens during a drought. And this is a little bit based on California's water policy, but this is generally a principle that most water utilities apply across the board. When there is a drought, the water utility will add a little fee to the end of your bill. And the reason they do this is to maintain their revenue requirements. So if I'm a water utility, I have expenses that I have to meet every month. And it's a crazy number, but 85% of most water utilities' expenses are paying off loans. It is paying off loans that they took out to build their large infrastructure projects, especially in water-stressed places like California. So if I'm a water utility, 15% of my costs go to actually providing you water. 85% of my costs go to building infrastructure that I had to put in place a long time ago to get you the water. As an industry, water is very capital intensive. The marginal cost of a unit of water is very, very low. What this means is that during a drought, if people start using less water, depending on what my rate structure might look like, water utilities run into a revenue deficit. If all of a sudden, all of us cut back our water use because the governor came on TV and asked us to do so, the water utility is going to lose a ton of money. And through this process, we had a lot of phone calls with water utilities, and most of them would say, we cannot wait for this drought to be over. And I would expect them to say, so that the environment returns to normal. And most of them would say, because we're broke. This drought has left us totally out of money. So water utilities, when there is a drought, will typically add a fee to your bill. Lots of times these are pre-approved and sort of negotiated. So when a drought is in place, there's some sort of action taken by the city council to say, yes, we are in a drought, we pulled the lever, it's now a drought. When a drought happens, your water bill changes overnight, and these little fixed charges are tacked on to the end. So this is the mechanism that your costs might increase during a drought, and our question is how this might impact water affordability. So if I'm thinking about my water bill might change, really it's because my water rate structure and my water use might change. So to do this, we actually have to build a relatively messy, econometric model of household water use. So we basically model water being used at individual households. We adjust it for the time of year. People use more water in the summer and they use less water in the winter. We adjust it on the basis of income. So people who make a little bit more money use a little bit more. And we adjust it on the basis of price. So if your water gets more expensive, your water use would go down. There's a couple big assumptions in there. So this is actually something that is a little bit debated by agricultural resource economists. The price elasticity of water demand, so the amount of your change in water use that would result in a change in water price, it's not as clear as you would imagine. Lots of times this is because people just auto pay their water bills and they don't really have a sense of how expensive it is. There's a weird mismatch of fixed and marginal costs in water bills that make it very difficult to estimate. There's a lot of debate as to what this impact actually is. Here we modeled it as being sort of very small, but there is a change in demand that results in a change in price. And then we did this for a case study in Santa Cruz, California, which is really, really nice for these purposes because Santa Cruz is a totally isolated water system. So Santa Cruz is not connected to the rest of the big state water drinking water infrastructure in California. They're very proud of the fact that they get all of their water locally from these 5 sources. So it's actually pretty easy to measure their inflows and their outflows and build a systems model of it. And that's exactly what we did. We built a model of the inflows and the outflows, and they have a little reservoir that they can use to kind of balance supply and demand. And so we built a water balance. We're looking at the amount of water going in and out of this utility. And we set some rules based on their city's decision-making priorities. So at a certain point, if there is a drought, they will have to expand their supplies or maybe put in place some kind of curtailment options. And oops, I don't know what's going on there. Okay, I promise I'm only pressing it once. I don't know what I have some kind of transition that's stuck inside these slides. Okay, I'm gonna do it one more time. I hope no one gets dizzy. We're gonna do this and we'll leave it here. So we imagine I feel like I've got a stack of plates. We're going to imagine a few different types of droughts. We're going to imagine the utility has some different options from an infrastructure perspective that they can take. And then they have some sort of measures of last resort that they can take at the end as well. So we imagine 4 different droughts. One of them is a baseline drought. So we look at the historical drought between 2016 and about 2019. We took that time period where water was very stressed in the central coast of California. Santa Cruz and Santa Barbara were 2 utilities that actually had to put in mandatory curtailment. So the city said, you guys have to stop using water. This is not something that is frequently done. Typically, it is something that is done, that people ask out of the goodwill, out of the kindness of your heart, please reduce your water use. Santa Cruz actually had to come through and say, like, if you don't cut your water use, we're going to fine you, or we're going to have some sort of penalty along with that. So it's a nice place because they really did have a lot of water stress. It's not nice for them, but it's nice for our model. So we look at this sort of baseline historical drought. We do a little bit of perturbing to imagine a world in which that drought is a little bit more intense. And then we perturb it a little bit and imagine a world in which that drought was a little bit longer. And then, of course, make it longer and more intense. And we imagine that our utility can then make one of 3 different options that are sort of big, expensive infrastructure options. So one of them is to do nothing. And they just imagine that our water supplies are our water supplies. The second one was to expand into a sort of low capacity water recycling plant. This is relatively cheap. I think somewhere in this big slide of numbers. Yep, somewhere in here. I've got that. Yep, they're on that slide. Do you guys mind if I just present it like this? I'm going to do this and share just the screen because I don't want to have to keep going through that. Do you all mind if I just present it like this so we don't have to keep? Thank you. Because we've got the numbers here. Let me move this out of the way, and then move this out of the way. One of the options was to build a low capacity sort of water recycling plant, and the other one was to build a very high capacity desalination plant. So we have estimates from some proposals that they were considering. They have different capital expenditures and operational expenditures, but these are 2 different things that they can put in place. And then finally, at the end of the day, we're imagining that if there is still a water shortage after the utility has invested in these supplies, that they have one of 2 options to deal with this. One option is to go through and do what they've done in the past and ask everybody to curtail their water use. So we're going to do a demand side intervention where we're going around to people's homes and we were saying, you have to stop using water. Usually this cutback is between 5 and 15%. Here we let it be variable. We sort of imagine that they had a perfect foresight and that they could imagine exactly how much water they needed to cut. The other alternative, which to be really clear, Santa Cruz does not have the ability to do this, but we imagined a world in which they could go buy water on a municipal water market. This is something that increasingly is becoming a very big market that large financial institutions are being a part of. There's actually a NASDAQ California Water Price Index. So you can go on NASDAQ, which has all of these different financial indicators. One of them is the cost of municipal water in California water markets. There's lots of buying and selling of trading of water that happens behind the scenes. So we imagine for a second that they could go buy water on one of these water markets. Again, they physically don't have the ability to do this because there's no pipe, but we thought for a second that maybe they could. So we evaluated all of the different combinations of these scenarios, and we wanted to then evaluate what would happen to household affordability. So using the water model on the previous slides, we can take these options, we can evaluate exactly how much water every household is going to use, and we'll make some adjustments when they build infrastructure options or if they do some type of mitigation. We're going to go ahead and adjust their rates to make sure that these utilities remain revenue neutral by adding these little fees at the end. So we go ahead and we adjust their rates as if there was a drought. We change the water use as if there was a drought. We model this for every household. And then we want to see what happens to the household water bills. So this slide is a lot, and I've got some sort of sub-slides that'll help us dig into this. The column on the left shows our annual bill changes for low-income households, and then the colors and the speckles show us across different options. The middle column shows us the annual change in high-income household water bills. Again, the speckles and the colors show us different combinations of some of these options I could have selected. And then on the far right is the utility cost. So this is what the cost would be to the utility. And the biggest takeaway that we need to highlight is that there are certain circumstances where bills go down for high-income households and they go up for low-income households. And we'll explain the mechanism on the other slide, but this is our first big takeaway. And what happens here is that when we have to do this process of curtailment, I have to do this process of asking people to cut their water use. In a perfect world with no fees, your water bill should go down because I'm using less water. Then at the same time, the utility tacks on these little extra fees at the end. And so your water bill is simultaneously going up and going down. It's going down because I'm using less water. It's going up because I have these fees attached to it. And if I'm a high income household, the net is that my water bill goes down. That reduction in water use is bigger than the fee. And if I'm a low income household, my water bill goes up. That reduction in use is not enough to make that fee. So this process of applying these drought surcharges has an impact that is asymmetric across high income and low income households. So this was our first big takeaway. Our second takeaway is that it really depends on how long your drought is. So this figure is showing for each one of these lines, it is the cumulative extra costs experienced by a household through the portion of the drought. So we can see that for most of them, the low income households are the top row, the high income households are the second row. For all low income households, bills start to go up, right? That line, this is the cumulative extra expense over time. That line starts to go up. And for high income households on the bottom, certain circumstances, the bill goes up. Other circumstances, the bills go down. What this also tells us, though, is that the line that is on the lowest line, right? The line that is closest to zero is the cheapest option at that point in time. And this is my cumulative extra cost. Each line is a different combination of options I could have selected. Whatever line is on the bottom was my cheapest one. And in certain scenarios, this switches, right? And it changes really only for the low income households. So this uncertainty in how long my drought might be, if all of a sudden I said the drought's over today, which is a very hard thing to determine, the costs, if I pick an option, I might pick the wrong option. And if I pick the wrong option, it has the potential to impact low income households. So the uncertainty in the length of drought really only changes my costs for low income households. For high income households, I would pick the same strategy regardless of the duration. The last thing we evaluated was infrastructure lock-in. So this is a thing that lots of utilities have to go through. There was a famous example of this in Australia where they built a giant desalination plant because there was a drought, and they were within a few months of the desalination plant opening, and the skies opened up, and this desalination plant was essentially no longer needed. They have to still pay off the loan, right? The financiers don't give them a break just because the drought's not there. So they are now locked into this. This is a process called infrastructure lock-in, and it essentially is paying for something that I might not need. Once I pay for it, I'm stuck with it. So to evaluate this, we imagined that these water bills were sort of artificially inflated, but their supplies weren't inflated. We're hypothesizing a world in which they've already gone in and built a big desalination plant, but they didn't build it big enough, and they still don't have enough supplies. So we just artificially increased the water rates, basically ran the same scenario, and found the exact same thing across the board, which is that really high-income households could be making out pretty well depending on the scenario, and low-income households will always have their bills increase. So there's a really unfortunate takeaway, which is that if I underexpand, if I don't do enough, which we saw in the previous slides, the result is really only experienced by low-income households. This is an example where I overexpanded. I increased my rates and I didn't need to. The impact is really only felt by low-income households. So we're showing how each of these decision-making foibles can lead to disproportionate impacts specifically for low-income households because of the way drought fees are applied. The last thing I'll highlight is that the price elasticity or the price responsiveness works a little bit, but it doesn't really help. So the idea here is that if people are sensitive to increases in the price of water, we would imagine that there is probably also a cross-price income elasticity. But basically, if people start to reduce their demand because the price goes up, this is something that kind of helps add virtual capacity, because when I build one of these infrastructure systems, I'm now going to increase my costs. These costs are passed on to you and you use less water. It's as if I built something larger, right? It is the same net in supply and demand that it is as if I built a larger infrastructure system. It doesn't help a ton. We used some examples of water price elasticities on the right. We tested examples as high as 0.8, which means that a 10% increase in the price of water would lead to an 8% reduction in water demand. This is like unheard of in history. These values are usually like 1%, maybe 2%. Some people think they're negative, so it's really not something that we can rely on. But we highlight it to say that maybe there is a sort of economic avenue to try to get ourselves out of this in very certain circumstances. So, in conclusion, we talked about different dimensions of access and how they compare to what we might call traditional ways of accessing things. So in the food context, we're thinking about geographic distance as our sort of standard way of imagining access, and actually these aspatial dimensions might be really important. And in the water context, I might think about access as I have a pipe going into your home, therefore you have access. But here we're adding this dimension of affordability and showing that there's also lots of asymmetry across who is experiencing challenges in affordability. With that, I think it's 3:50. I think that's all I have. Thank you all so much for coming.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I've been to Santa Cruz a few times and it's a beautiful place and the housing is insanely expensive. So I know like a lot of people, I mean, even rent for like a 2-bedroom is in the like 4,000 range. So how might this shift, assuming like renters are a larger percentage of the housing community and maybe are paying their water bill directly, is that then going to landlords?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That would be kind of like the best case scenario, right? Is that landlords deal with this instead of the renters. There's an element of this that makes it better and an element of this that makes it worse. The element of it that makes it worse is that there has been a little bit of literature about the relationship between renters and landlords and utility pricing, and it's all over the map. So sometimes there's no law that I am aware of that says like this has to be sort of really specifically contractually defined. Usually how this works, if you have a big multi-unit house, the landlord will pay the water for the whole building and they pay on a different set of fees that's closer to what like an industrial user might use because the water demand is really high. And then it is up to the landlord to dictate the relationship of that use and the tenant. So it's a very opaque process. What does tend to happen though, and we see this in data in California, is that rental properties tend to have higher occupancy rates. There are more people per unit. And so this is not so good because it increases your water use. That's the biggest determinant of indoor water use, is how many people you have in your home. If you're talking about outdoor water use, which is like sprinkling and watering your lawn, right? This is really based on the size of your lot, so it's kind of proportional to income. But really, those are the things that drive water use. So I think that if we have more renters, we have higher people per unit. And a unit would be an account that's sort of paying for this, that the water use goes up. Maybe it's sort of divided out in a different way because of more tenants, but I can't exactly think of the conclusion.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, really great talk. Fascinating on each part. I was kind of hoping at the end you'd circle into this sort of comparing or bringing the two together and thinking about, as water rates increase for low-income individuals during a drought, how does that then affect their affordability of living in a food apartheid, which I think some scholars are calling it a food desert because it's often political and racialized. Have you thought about those dynamics and how they might be related to each other?
That's a great idea. That's really interesting because it is. I mean, when we had the equation where the water was weird, just got it wrong. We had the equation, discussing water affordability, which is my water cost divided by my total income. There is a lot of discussion about what that denominator should be, and usually this is motivated when thinking about it from I need to have a house to have a water bill. So I need to have somewhere to live to have a water bill. So I should probably not include that because there's no way I'm going to pay my water bill there's no way I'm not going to pay my mortgage and I will pay my water bill. And there's a sort of, people have tried to create a hierarchy of that. And truth be told, I don't remember where food lands in that, but I would bet it's pretty close. So that's a very interesting comparison, but no, we haven't linked them up together.
Especially with like, I mean, environmental disaster or drought, how that shapes the entire experience. I mean, for one, when you lose access to water altogether, then you're having to buy water. So then, or it's being distributed by the government. I mean, that changes the whole dynamic of water accessibility.
Absolutely. And there's I can point to a scholar who I know recently dug into this, Khalid Osman, who has looked at water quality and its impact on affordability. Because if the number that I said was we're paying about $5 per CCF. So that's $5 for 700 gallons of water. And now if you just imagine you go to a grocery store and you buy like a gallon of desalinated water, that's $1 a gallon. So that's $700 for 700 gallons, right? So the price that you are paying municipally is orders of magnitude cheaper than if you were to buy water in one of those big coolers where you have a little water cooler, you're buying bottled water. And the reason, to my understanding, that people do that is water aesthetics. And so maybe water meets the Safe Water Act rules, but it can still smell weird or taste weird. And so there's other reasons why you might go try to buy water. And
or there's a huge sewage spill into the Potomac and you're
right. I would wager that it's a very similar population of folks that are also experiencing food access. Yeah, it's a great idea.
I believe that a lot of Southern California receives water from the Colorado River Basin, and I'm just wondering how utilities handle that, because on the one hand, if there's no water stress, they want people to use their water, but there's this pressure to reduce their water use by the upper states from the Colorado River Basin. So.
It's a really interesting mismatch. So there is a trend in what we would call infrastructure decoupling. And so it is decoupling finances and service. And the people have kind of sold this as like, rather than paying your water bill where you're paying for water, you're just paying a subscription. There's a lot of people who are really into this, that you just pay $80 a month and you get all the water that you want. The conservation element of it is totally thrown out the window. So sometimes this is coupled with like very invasive water surveillance where I let my water utility sort of like meter all the things in my house and they can penalize me. There's a few different ways of doing that. The people who are worried about water affordability are really excited about something that is a fixed rate. And the people who are worried about conservation are really excited about ramping up the rate of increase of my water tariffs. There are some clever ways to try to get around this. There are a couple Southern California utilities that have basically gone door to door and they've done surveys of people's homes. And they say, you've got 4 toilets, 2 showers, 15 people living here, whatever your situation is. We're going to run some numbers and say, we think you should use this much water. If you use that much, we'll charge you wholesale for that plus 10%. And if you go a little bit above that, we're going to really ratchet your costs through the roof. And so it's called a water budget. It only has ever been implemented, to my knowledge, in very wealthy neighborhoods because they're the ones that have the tax base to hire the people to go do the surveys. It's very labor intensive. And we think based on some weird legal precedent in California, it's actually totally illegal because you and I could live in the same neighborhood, use the same amount of water and pay different costs for it. That's a huge no-no in California water politics. So there's a couple creative economic solutions to this, but it is one of the sort of pillars of rate design. I think I had it on here at some point. The American Water Works Association has the pillars of rate design, and it is balancing revenue stability with affordability and conservation. These are like the 3 things that are almost always in trade-off with one another. So it's a really tough thing that becomes even more exacerbated when you have weird cross-jurisdictional challenges. We see this in North Carolina because water utilities are buying each other. And so there's this big thing about regionalization where small utilities are selling their assets to other utilities. It usually ends up working out financially for both of them because the small utility can sell, and now I don't have to like hire HR people, right? And so there's an economies of scale that comes that the larger utility can give me cheaper water than I could produce myself. But now sometimes we have these, it's almost like gerrymandered water utilities that cross multiple counties. And it's actually a conversation we're having right now because of data centers. Data centers are coming into rural areas in North Carolina. They're setting up shop and the county gets tax revenue for it. And they use a ton of water, but the water utility is now across multiple counties. So everybody in the water district now has higher rates, but only the people in this county are seeing the new schools or the new jails or the new infrastructure that comes from the tax revenue. So there's a huge asymmetry that is right on the cusp of popping up in North Carolina because of this process, this problem that there's a sort of mismatch of the scales of use and of production.
I'm interested in your food affordability. I've been in quite a few natural disasters, mostly hurricanes. And right after the cyclone or the hurricane, you see price gouging, significant. And I don't see any studies or research done on policies. And it usually impacts the very poor are the ones that have been impacted by these significant natural disasters. Have you thought of doing anything in that area?
No, I haven't, but that's such a good idea. No, I haven't at all, but it is something that this is one of the directions that we have this Google review data temporarily.
Yeah.
And so not at the, it'd be tough to get micro scale, like we know that the gouging is happening right now, so the affordability stage. But at a higher level, we have seen things like COVID, and we have some sort of preliminary analysis that shows what people perceive during COVID, before COVID, and after COVID. And we can see that because there's a sort of natural experiment that the perceptions change before and after. But that's a really interesting idea because it is where affordability is certainly the most stressed.
Totally.
I mean, access across the board is really stressed. And this is something that there's lots of research on people having road closures. And so you can't get to stores or the store doesn't have power. I actually have a student thinking about this now. But no, I haven't thought about the specific affordability of price gouging. And that's a great idea. I wish I had more to say about it.
We'll be in touch.
For the food portion, did you account for selection bias, or is there a way of doing that?
No, and it's huge. And I get to tell a funny story about this, which is that I have non-academic friends and they don't really know what I do. And they're being very kind and asking a lot of questions. And one of my friends described that her dad, who's like a 65-year-old retired colonel in the Navy, I think, Air Force, is a big Yelp guy. And he loves Yelp and he puts Yelp reviews out of everything. So much so that he was invited to the Yelpies, which is an award show for Yelp reviews. And he won the Yelpie for a review of a rest stop on I-95. He won the Yelpie. And my friend said that not only did he go to the Yelpies just with beaming with excitement, but he left and he was like, it's all old retired white guys. He like all of his friends are like Yelpy people. And I was like, yeah, actually that makes a ton of sense, right? Of like who's writing these Google reviews. So no, we cannot account for, we do not have demographic information or any way to identify who is writing the review. But all of these perceptions are only perceptions of people who write Google reviews, which is a very small subset of the population.
I guess I'm also thinking that if your expectations are met, not exceed, that you might not write a review. It's only if they're exceeded or not met, right?
One thing we did do, so we can track, we don't know who it is, but I can track if the same person has reviewed multiple places. So we do have this population of super reviewers that are reviewed like over half of the store. Maybe you're one of these people. You've reviewed over all the stores in the town. Their perceptions of a store were exactly the same as anyone who just reviewed one. And that really assuaged a lot of this feels good. Our thought behind that is that if someone has actually been to a bunch of stores and comes to my store and says it sucks, and I also think it's not so good, right? That they align. And so it helps us to kind of calibrate that a little bit, but it certainly doesn't fully address it.